The Whispering Woods. I'm not sure why we decided to come here. It seemed like a good idea at the time, a weekend getaway in the middle of nowhere. No cell service, no obligations, just me and my friends, surrounded by the towering pines of the Whispering Woods. Emma was the ringleader. She'd found the place online, some obscure travel blog boasting about its untouched beauty and off-the-grid charm. Jason, her boyfriend, was all in because, well, he'd follow Emma anywhere. Then there was Sarah, my best friend since high school, and Chris, the jokester of the group. And me? I'm Ashley, the reluctant tag-along, always looking for a reason to stay home but too afraid of missing out to say no. The drive was long, the kind that makes you question if you've made a mistake with every mile. By the time we reached the edge of the forest, the sun was already dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The Whispering Woods stretched out before us like a dark promise, its ancient trees standing sentinel against the encroaching night. "This is it," Emma announced, practically bouncing out of the car. Her excitement was infectious, even if the place gave me the creeps. There was something about the way the shadows seemed to move among the trees, how the air felt heavier here, almost alive. We set up camp in a small clearing a little ways off the main trail. The fire crackled to life, casting flickering light across our faces as we roasted marshmallows and traded stories. For a while, it felt perfect. The kind of night you'd look back on fondly, remembering the laughter and the warmth of friends. But then the whispers started. At first, I thought it was the wind. It wasn't until I saw Sarah stiffen, her marshmallow sliding into the flames, that I realized I wasn't the only one who'd heard it. "Did you guys," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hear that?" Jason finished for her. He looked around, his expression suddenly wary. "Yeah. What was it?" "Probably just the wind," Chris said, though he didn't sound convinced. His usual bravado was missing, replaced by an edge of uncertainty. We sat there in silence, listening. The whispers were faint, just on the edge of hearing, like someone speaking from the shadows. I couldn't make out any words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was teasing, taunting, like it knew we were listening. Emma laughed, though it sounded forced. "You guys are letting the woods get to you. It's nothing." She poked at the fire with a stick, sparks dancing into the night. But as the hours dragged on, the whispers didn't stop. If anything, they grew louder, more insistent. By the time we crawled into our tents, I was wide awake, every rustle of leaves and snap of twigs setting my nerves on edge. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps outside my tent. They were slow, deliberate, crunching on the dry leaves. My heart pounded as I strained to hear, every muscle in my body tensed. "Jason?" I whispered, hoping it was one of my friends. There was no answer. Just the footsteps, circling my tent. And then the whispers began again, so close it sounded like they were right outside the thin nylon walls. "Ashley." My breath caught in my throat. They, whoever they were, knew my name. I stayed frozen, clutching my sleeping bag like it could somehow protect me. The whispers continued, a disjointed symphony of voices all murmuring at once. I couldn't understand them, but the tone was unmistakable, mocking, cruel. Eventually, the footsteps and whispers faded, but I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I found Emma and Jason already up, sitting by the fire with mugs of instant coffee. Their faces were pale, their eyes bloodshot. "Did you hear it last night?" Emma asked as I sat down. Her voice was steady, but there was a tremor in her hands. "Yeah," I admitted. "Voices. And footsteps. They knew my name." Jason's head snapped up. "They knew mine too. I heard them whispering it, over and over." Chris and Sarah joined us shortly after, both looking just as shaken. It was clear none of us had slept much, if at all. Over breakfast, we debated what to do. It's probably just our imaginations, Emma insisted. Or, I don't know, maybe there's someone messing with us. Kids or something. Kids? Chris scoffed. Out here? In the middle of nowhere? Who else would it be? She shot back. I don't know, Sarah said quietly, her gaze fixed on the forest. But I don't think we're alone. That statement hung in the air like a storm cloud. None of us wanted to admit it, but we all felt the same thing. The woods were watching us. We spent the day hiking, trying to shake the unease that clung to us like a second skin. The forest was beautiful in the daylight, but the feeling of being watched never went away. Every so often, I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow that vanished the moment I turned my head. By the time we got back to camp, the sun was already sinking. None of us wanted to be out after dark. We built the fire high and sat close, our conversation strained and uneasy. And then we found the carvings. It was Chris who noticed them first, etched into the bark of a tree just outside the clearing. Symbols, crude but deliberate, arranged in a pattern that made my skin crawl. Beneath them, a single word. Leave. Okay, that's it, Jason said, his voice shaking. We're out of here. First thing tomorrow. Tomorrow? Sarah echoed. Why not now? Because it's already dark, Emma said. You want to try finding your way out of here in the middle of the night? Sarah didn't argue, but the tension between them was palpable. None of us felt safe anymore, but leaving seemed just as dangerous as staying. That night, the whispers came again, louder this time, more insistent. And as I lay there, staring at the shadows dancing on the walls of my tent, I realized something horrifying. They weren't just outside. They were inside, too. Morning came as a small mercy, though the sun's light did little to chase away the creeping dread that had taken root in our camp. None of us spoke much as we packed up. Every sound, the snap of a twig, the call of a bird, set my nerves on edge. We were all desperate to leave, but the forest seemed reluctant to let us go. As we set out, the trail that had seemed so clear the day before was now unnervingly difficult to follow. Trees that should have been familiar felt out of place, their twisted branches looming overhead like silent witnesses. Emma led the way, her GPS clutched tightly in her hand, though it seemed to be glitching. The blue dot representing our location flickered and jumped, refusing to stay on the path. It's just the signal, Emma muttered, more to herself than to us. Her usual confidence was waning, replaced by a growing frustration. Maybe we should just go back to camp and wait for help, Sarah suggested. Her voice was small, but her words carried an unspoken fear. We're not going back, Jason snapped, his tone sharper than intended. He immediately softened, glancing at Sarah. Sorry. I can't stay here another night. Neither could I. None of us could. We pressed on, each step feeling heavier than the last. The whispers returned by midday. At first, they were faint, almost imperceptible beneath the crunch of leaves and the rustle of the wind. But as the hours dragged on, they grew louder, more distinct. And they were closer now, no longer content to linger at the edges of hearing. Ashley. I froze. The voice was clear, as if someone had spoken directly into my ear. My stomach churned as I turned to find no one behind me. What is it? Sarah asked, noticing my hesitation. Nothing, I lied, my voice trembling. But it wasn't nothing. The whispers weren't random. They were calling us by name, each of us in turn. And worse, they seemed to know things. Ashley, why didn't you tell them? The voice hissed, its tone dripping with malice. My blood ran cold. It wasn't possible. No one could know about that. Ashley? Jason's voice broke through my thoughts, his concerned gaze fixed on me. You okay?" I nodded quickly, forcing my feet to move. But the whispers didn't stop, and the secrets they unearthed were only getting darker. By late afternoon, it felt as though the forest itself had turned against us. The trail had disappeared entirely, leaving us stumbling through dense undergrowth that seemed to grow thicker with every step. Each of us was on edge, our nerves fraying as the whispers continued their relentless assault. They weren't just voices anymore. They were specific, targeted. Every secret, every hidden shame we thought buried was dragged into the open by those unseen mouths. "Jason," one voice murmured, smooth and venomous. "Does Emma know what you did?" Jason froze, his face pale as he whipped around. "Who said that?" he demanded, his voice cracking. We all stopped, exchanging uneasy glances. None of us had spoken. "Jason, what's it talking about?" Emma asked, her eyes narrowing. There was an edge to her voice, a sharpness that hadn't been there before. "Nothing," Jason muttered, but his body language betrayed him. He wouldn't meet her gaze. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Chris broke it with a nervous laugh. "Maybe we're all just losing it. Too much stress and not enough sleep." "Yeah, maybe," I said, though I didn't believe it. None of us did. By nightfall, we were forced to stop and make camp. It was clear we weren't getting out before dark, and wandering aimlessly in the forest at night felt like a death sentence. The clearing we found was smaller and less comforting than the one before. The trees loomed closer, their gnarled branches reaching like skeletal fingers. We built a fire again, but it did little to dispel the chill that seeped into my bones. Dinner was a tense affair. None of us spoke much, and when we did, the conversation was stilted and forced. The whispers were louder now, a constant background hum that made it impossible to relax. Then came the scream. It was Sarah. She'd been sitting quietly by the fire when her eyes widened in terror, her mouth opening in a blood-curdling scream. She scrambled to her feet, backing away from us like we were the enemy. "Sarah!" I cried, rushing to her side. "What's wrong?" But she didn't answer. Her gaze was fixed on something just beyond the firelight, her face pale as a ghost. "They're here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They're watching us." "Who?" Emma demanded, her own fear barely contained. "Who's watching us?" Sarah didn't answer. Instead, she pointed into the darkness, her hand shaking. I followed her gaze but saw nothing, just the endless shadows of the forest. "Sarah, there's no one there," Chris said, his attempt at reassurance falling flat. But Sarah shook her head violently. "No. No, they're here. I saw them. I saw their faces." "What did they look like?" Jason asked, his voice low. She hesitated, her eyes darting around the clearing. They looked like us." No one slept that night. We sat in a tight circle around the fire, the shadows pressing in closer with every passing hour. The whispers didn't stop, and neither did Sarah's ramblings. She kept muttering about the faces, about how they were waiting for us to make a mistake. And then we heard it, the unmistakable sound of laughter. But it wasn't coming from any of us. It echoed from the trees, a deep, guttural sound that sent shivers down my spine. Chris was the first to crack. "Okay, I'm done. We're leaving. Now." "Chris, it's pitch black out there," Emma argued. "You'll get lost." "Better lost than staying here with, whatever this is," he snapped, his voice rising. "I'm not waiting around to find out what happens next." He grabbed his backpack and a flashlight, stomping off into the woods without another word. We called after him, but he didn't look back. We didn't see him again. The hours dragged on, the fire slowly dying as our supplies of wood ran low. Jason and Emma were fighting quietly, their whispers barely audible over the ever-present voices. Sarah was curled up in a ball, rocking back and forth as she muttered under her breath. And me? I just sat there, staring into the flames, trying to drown out the whispers in my head. Ashley, one of them hissed, closer than ever. You can't hide from this. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block it out. But the voice wouldn't stop. They know what you did. You're not innocent. Tears streamed down my face as the memories resurfaced, memories I'd buried deep, memories I never wanted to face again. The voices knew. They knew everything. Stop it. I screamed, jumping to my feet. Everyone turned to look at me, their expressions a mix of confusion and fear. What's wrong? Emma asked cautiously. They won't shut up. I cried, clutching my head. They keep talking, keep. My words were cut off by another scream, this time from Jason. He was staring into the trees, his face twisted in horror. What is it? Emma asked, grabbing his arm. There's someone out there, he whispered. I saw them. They looked like Chris. We all froze. The fire flickered, casting long shadows that danced around the clearing. For a moment, none of us moved, our ears straining for any sound. Then we heard it, the crunch of leaves, the snap of a branch. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching from the darkness. And then a voice. Familiar, but wrong. Hey, guys, it said. It's me. Chris. But it wasn't Chris. Not really. We froze, staring into the trees where the voice had come from. It was Chris's voice, but it wasn't him. The cadence was off, the tone a little too smooth, too calculated. And then he stepped into the firelight. It looked like Chris. Same disheveled hair, same lopsided grin. But his eyes, they were empty. Hollow, like two black pits that drank in the light. Chris? Emma's voice wavered, filled with equal parts hope and fear. The thing tilted its head, as if amused. Yeah, it's me. I got turned around in the woods, but I'm back now. No, Jason said, stepping between Emma and the figure. That's not him. Oh, come on, man. The not Chris chuckled, but it was a sound devoid of warmth. Don't be paranoid. It's me. Jason didn't waver. What's the name of your dog? He demanded. The figure paused, its grin faltering. Then it smiled again, wider this time, too wide for any human face. Why does that matter? It asked, its voice shifting, deepening. You already know I'm not your friend. The firelight flickered, casting grotesque shadows across its face. The grin widened further, the corners of its mouth splitting, revealing rows of jagged teeth. Run, Jason whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. And then it lunged. We scattered into the woods, panic overriding any semblance of logic. The darkness swallowed us, branches clawing at our faces and limbs as we sprinted blindly. I could hear Emma screaming somewhere behind me, her voice cutting off suddenly. I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I kept running, the sound of pursuit always just behind me. The whispers grew louder, more frenzied, overlapping in a chaotic cacophony. Finally, I tripped, my foot catching on a root. I hit the ground hard, the air knocked from my lungs. I lay there, gasping, waiting for whatever was chasing me to strike. But nothing happened. Slowly, I lifted my head, peering into the shadows. Hello, Ashley. I screamed. The figure standing before me wasn't Chris this time, it was me. My own face stared back at me, twisted into a grotesque parody of a smile. Its eyes were black voids, and its mouth moved in ways no human mouth should. Why do you run? It asked, its voice a distorted echo of my own. You can't escape yourself. I scrambled backward, tears streaming down my face. The thing didn't follow. It just stood there, watching, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. "Leave me alone!" I shouted, my voice breaking. It laughed, a cruel, mocking sound that echoed through the trees. "But you invited us," it said. "You and your friends. You came to our woods." I stumbled to my feet and turned to run, but the whispers swelled, disorienting me. They weren't just sounds anymore, they were inside my head, filling it with a torrent of images and emotions. Regret. Shame. Guilt. Memories I'd buried resurfaced with brutal clarity. A fight with Sarah that ended our friendship for months. Lies I'd told to protect myself at someone else's expense. Mistakes I couldn't take back, no matter how much I wanted to. The whispers fed on them, growing stronger, louder. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. And then I saw the others. I stumbled into another clearing, and there they were, Emma, Jason, and Sarah. They stood in a circle, their expressions blank, their eyes unfocused. Chris's body lay crumpled at their feet, his face frozen in a rictus of terror. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice trembling. They didn't answer. Slowly, they turned to look at me, their movements unnervingly synchronized. "They've taken you too," Sarah said, her voice devoid of emotion. "We can't let it happen again." "What are you talking about?" I backed away, my heart pounding. "It's me. It's Ashley." "Are you?" Jason asked, his tone eerily calm. "Or are you one of them?" The firelight flickered, casting their faces in grotesque shadows. For a moment, they didn't look like my friends. They looked like the things from the woods, empty, soulless. "Please," I begged. "It's me." Emma stepped forward, holding something in her hand, a knife. Its blade gleamed in the dim light, slick with what I could only assume was Chris's blood. "Prove it," she said. I don't remember what I said, only that I kept talking, desperate to convince them. The whispers were louder than ever, almost drowning out my own voice. The air was thick with tension, the line between friend and foe blurring with every passing second. Finally, Sarah lowered her gaze, her grip on her own weapon slackening. "It's her," she said, though she didn't sound convinced. "I think it's her." Jason hesitated, then nodded. "We need to leave," he said. "Now." But as we turned to go, the forest erupted in movement. Shadows poured from the trees, their shapes shifting and writhing. The whispers became a roar, a deafening tide of sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. We ran, our fear driving us forward even as the shadows closed in around us. The forest twisted and warped, the path ahead seeming to stretch endlessly. My legs felt like lead, my lungs burning with every breath. And then, just when I thought we were doomed, the trees parted, revealing a small cabin nestled in the darkness. A faint light glowed from within, a beacon in the nightmare. Without hesitation, we sprinted toward it, throwing open the door and slamming it shut behind us. The whispers stopped. For the first time in what felt like hours, there was silence. The cabin was old, its walls lined with dusty shelves and faded photographs. A fire burned in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the room. It felt safe. Too safe. "What is this place?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. None of us answered. We were too busy catching our breath, our eyes scanning the room for any signs of danger. But the cabin seemed empty, abandoned. And then we heard it, a single knock at the door. We exchanged terrified glances, none of us daring to move. Another knock, louder this time. And then a voice, muffled but unmistakable. "Hey, guys. It's me. Chris." The knocking continued, steady and deliberate. Each time it sounded, the atmosphere in the cabin grew heavier, as though the walls were closing in. None of us dared approach the door. "Don't open it," Jason whispered, his voice barely audible. But what if, Emma began, only for Jason to cut her off with a sharp shake of his head. It's not him, Jason said firmly. You saw what happened back there. Hey, come on, guys, the voice outside called again. It's cold out here. Let me in. My stomach churned. It was Chris's voice, but it wasn't. There was something off about it, something hollow. I can't take this, Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. She backed away from the door, her hands trembling. This isn't happening. This can't be happening. The knocking stopped. For a moment, silence enveloped us, broken only by the crackling of the fire. I let out a shaky breath, my body sagging with relief. And then the voice came again, this time from inside the cabin. You should have opened the door. We spun around, our eyes darting to every shadowy corner. The cabin was small, just a single room with nowhere for someone to hide. But the voice was unmistakable, and it was close. Where are you? Jason shouted, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and anger. The only response was a low, rumbling laugh that seemed to emanate from the very walls. The fire flickered, its light dimming as the shadows deepened. The air grew colder, and the whispers returned, swirling around us in an unholy chorus. They're playing with us, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. They're trying to break us. Well, it's working. Sarah snapped, her fear bubbling over into anger. What do we do? Jason's jaw tightened. We stick together. Whatever happens, we don't split up. The cabin creaked, the sound like a groan of protest. The laughter grew louder, overlapping with the whispers until it was all I could hear. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. And then the light went out. The darkness was absolute. I couldn't see my own hand in front of my face, let alone my friend's. Panic surged through me as I stumbled backward, my heart pounding. Ashley? Emma's voice called out, somewhere to my left. I'm here. I shouted, reaching out blindly. My fingers brushed against something cold and clammy. I recoiled with a gasp. It's me, Jason said, his voice steady but strained. Stay close. The whispers were louder than ever, filling the void with their sinister murmurings. They spoke in disjointed phrases, their words a mix of familiar voices and alien tongues. And then, amidst the chaos, I heard something that froze me in place. You can leave, a voice said, clear and deliberate. It wasn't a whisper, it was a command. But only one of you. What? Emma asked, her voice trembling. You heard me, the voice replied. It was everywhere and nowhere, resonating within the walls of the cabin. One of you can leave. The others stay. No, Jason said firmly. We're not playing your game. Oh, but you already are, the voice taunted. You've been playing since the moment you entered the woods. The cabin creaked again, the sound deafening in the darkness. And then, like a spotlight, a single beam of light pierced the blackness, illuminating the door. Choose, the voice demanded. Or no one leaves. We stood there, paralyzed by the impossible choice. The light around the door pulsed like a heartbeat, its glow casting eerie shadows across the room. I'm not staying, Sarah said suddenly, her voice trembling. I can't. I won't. Sarah, no. Jason reached for her, but she pulled away, her eyes wide with desperation. I'm sorry, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. She bolted for the door, her movements frantic and uncoordinated. The moment she touched the handle, the whispers stopped. For a moment, there was silence. And then Sarah screamed. The light flared, blinding in its intensity. When it dimmed, she was gone. The door stood open, revealing nothing but impenetrable darkness beyond. Sarah? Emma called out, her voice breaking. There was no answer. The door slammed shut on its own, the sound echoing like a gunshot. The whispers returned, louder and more frenzied than before. They overlapped, growing into a deafening roar that made my head feel like it was splitting open. "They're lying," Jason shouted over the noise. "No one gets out. This is just another trick." "What do we do?" Emma cried, clutching my arm. Before I could answer, the whispers shifted, coalescing into a single voice. "End it." The words hung in the air like a command. The fire flared back to life, illuminating the room in a sickly orange glow. And there, on the floor in front of us, lay a knife. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "I won't." "You will," the voice replied, its tone filled with cold certainty. "Or you'll all stay." Jason stepped forward, his expression grim. "No," he said, his voice steady. "We're not playing by your rules." The laughter returned, mocking and cruel. "You think you have a choice?" Jason grabbed the knife, but instead of turning it on one of us, he drove it into the cabin floor. The whispers faltered, the laughter cutting off abruptly. "You want us to destroy each other," Jason said, his voice rising. "But we're stronger than that." For a moment, the cabin seemed to hesitate, as if the forest itself was reconsidering. The fire flickered, the shadows retreating. And then, with a deafening crack, the walls began to splinter. "Run!" Jason shouted, grabbing my hand. We bolted for the door, which now stood open, light streaming through it. Emma was right behind us, her breaths ragged. The forest was a blur as we ran, the whispers fading with every step. The air grew lighter, the oppressive weight lifting. And then, just as suddenly as it began, we were out. We collapsed on the forest floor, gasping for air. The morning sun filtered through the trees, its warmth a stark contrast to the cold terror we'd just escaped. But as we sat there, trying to make sense of what had happened, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The woods were silent now, but I could still feel them watching. Waiting. We never found Sarah. And none of us ever returned to the Whispering Woods. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers.